could you say that? How could you think that was the right thing to say? How could you think that that would make me feel better, or that that would achieve your goal, that that would persuade me? Have you ever had one of those conversations? Somebody says something to you and you just can't believe that they said what they said. It's so inappropriate. It's so ineffective. Even when you tell them that that didn't work, that that was ineffective, they still think it was the right thing to say. How could two people misunderstand one another so fundamentally? I'm Bruce Lambert from HowCommunicationWorks.com, and what I want to talk to you about today is the source of these kinds of really deep fundamental misunderstandings. And they have to do with the fact that people use fundamentally different premises, different logics, different ways of reasoning about language and communication. And I want to describe to you what the three basic types of logic that people use, or ways of understanding the purpose of language, the purpose of communication. And when people disagree about how language works and what it's for, and how communication works and what it's for, you can get these really basic misunderstandings about what's effective and what's not, and what's appropriate and what's not. So in this goes back to a paper that a professor of communication named Barbara O'Keefe wrote in 1988, and it was called The Logic of Message Design, Individual Differences in Reasoning About Communication. And Barbara O'Keefe had been studying the way communication skill developed between childhood to adulthood, and she was also looking at individual differences in communication skill. And it turns out that there are big differences in communication skill. If you give people a difficult communication task, people produce very, very different responses to the same task. Different people produce very different responses to the same task. There's one particular difficult communication situation which I've studied a lot in my career. We call it the group project task, or the RON task. And this, you're asked to imagine that you're the head of a group project at school or at work, and there's one member of your group, Ron. We've all known people like Ron. Ron was recommended very highly to your group. You were happy to have him, but it turned out when the project got started, he was coming late to meetings. He didn't show up to some meetings at all without calling. He just wasn't participating very effectively. The team is getting together tomorrow to finish the project. The night before, Ron calls you and says he's not going to have his part done. He just needs more time. So the question is, what do you say to Ron? This is a difficult task for many people, and you get very different responses. On one end of the spectrum, you get people that basically say, Ron, you idiot, you're fired. How could you do this? You're such a jerk. Don't you know what this does to me? You're fired. Then you get some people who say things like, Ron, we all have certain rights and responsibilities, and you promised to get your part done. You have a responsibility to the group and to everyone else in the project and to our boss and to the organization to get your part done. There's no more time. You must get it done. And if you don't get it done, there will be severe consequences. And finally, you get people who see the task very differently. They say things like, Ron, thanks so much for calling and letting me know about these challenges. I can see you must be under some difficult constraints. Ron, I know you're a cooperative, hardworking, intelligent guy. I know you're the type of guy who wants to do your part in this project. And I'm sure you're looking for a way to get your part done before tomorrow. So maybe we could get together and figure out a plan where we could rearrange your priorities so you could get your work done. They say things like that. Now, I'm just making up these messages, but these are similar to hundreds of messages that I've seen in response to this Ron situation. So these three different kinds of messages reflect three fundamentally different ways of thinking about language and communication. And Barbara O'Keefe called these the logics of message design, or message design logics. And there's three of them, and I want to describe them for you in a subsequent video. I'll show you some examples of messages that are generated by these different logics, but first I just want to describe and define them to you. And I think this will be useful to you. So next time somebody says something to you that seems really inappropriate, bizarre, think about the fact that it could be coming from this different logic that they're using, this totally fundamentally different way that they're thinking about how language works and how communication works. And this will lead them to make different choices about what's appropriate and so on and so forth. So the first of these message design logics, and remember, the logic is what connects your goals to the words you choose or the actions you choose to do in communication. So the logic says, anytime we're trying to solve a problem, we're reasoning from the goals to the means for achieving those goals. So in communication, the goals are things like, get Ron to do his part, maintain a relationship with Ron, tell Ron how you feel, whatever your goals are. You have to take those goals and then reason to what are the verbal mechanisms or means or strategies I'm going to use to achieve this goal. So the message design logic is what connects the goals to the verbal means for achieving those goals. And people have these different patterns of reasoning. So the first we call the expressive logic. The expressive logic says that each of these logics has a set of defining features. So the expressive logic of message design, the fundamental premise is that language is a medium for expressing your thoughts and emotions. This is what children first learn about language. Or this is what Helen Keller learned when she felt the water falling on her hands and she realized she could use sign language to express her thoughts and emotions. This is what babies learn when they realize they can use words to express the inner contents of their head. This is the expressive principle of language, the most fundamental power of language to express our thoughts and emotions. So the expressive logic thinks the purpose of language and the fundamental premise is express my thoughts and emotions. When someone with an expressive logic asks himself what makes a message good or bad, they think a message is good to the extent that it's clear and honest and open and that they signal what they're thinking in an unedited way. That's what they think makes a message good. To the extent that the contents of my head are completely clear to you, that's what makes a message effective. They think that the key function of the message is just self-expression. I just want to say what I feel. And all of this comes from Barbara O'Keefe's 1988 paper. How does an expressive logic orient to time? They're basically reacting to the past, typically. How do they relate to the context? They don't pay much attention to the context because for the expressive, they're not thinking about the context. They're just thinking about what am I thinking and how can I clearly express to you what I'm thinking? That's the only goal of the expressive, is express to you what I'm thinking. What makes an expressive message coherent? What makes the parts hang together? Well, they don't often hang together. If someone says something incoherent to you, if they send you an incoherent message, which seems to be just an incoherent jumble of thoughts, that's the expressive logic, because there's no context or rules making things coherent. It's just, what am I thinking? And often our thoughts are incoherent, so the expressive just is expressing these incoherent thoughts. How do you know when a message is generated by this expressive logic? It often seems pointless. So these expressive messages in the Ron situation, they sort of fire Ron, but really the pragmatic point of the conversation with Ron is to try to get him to do his work. Often expressive messages in response to the Ron situation never even ask Ron to do his work. They just vent. So that's the expressive logic. So I've talked in previous videos about the need to manage threats to face. Face is our desire to be liked and approved of and our desire to be left alone. And in every communication situation, we have to manage threats to face. And so how does an expressive manage threats to face? Basically by editing. Maybe they feel like dropping an F-bomb on somebody, but they don't. They edit the F-bomb, and that's the only accommodation they make to face. So they feel like calling them names or insulting their mother or something like that, but they won't because they don't want to threaten face, even though they'll say a lot of other stuff that's probably face-threatening. So this is the lowest level of developmental skill. So if you look at communication as a developmental skill that develops from childhood through adolescence to adulthood, the expressive logic is the first one that we all acquire when we learn that language can be used to express our thoughts. But eventually, we learn that language is a game played by social rules, and that these rules are rules of appropriateness, rules of politeness, rules where the situation tells us what to say. And so for the conventional, the fundamental premise of communication is that language is a game played by social rules. And when they think about what makes a message good or bad, it's appropriateness. They're often thinking about control of resources in a conventional social situation, and they're thinking about cooperativeness. So to the extent that a message is cooperative and talks about control of resources or is appropriate to the context, they think it's a good message. How is a conventional message oriented towards time? It's normally oriented towards the present, whereas the expressive message is oriented to the past. The conventional message tends to be oriented to the present. and specified by the context. The conventional message believes, conventional message design logic says the main thing is to say what's appropriate to this context, that context determines content. And if I just understand the context appropriately, I will know what to say, because I'm always trying to say the appropriate thing for this context, what's conventionally appropriate. Let's see. So how do we know when a message is conventional? We often hear things like reference to rights and obligations. So in the Ron situation, the group project situation, we often hear conventional message producers reminding Ron of his responsibility. Ron, you have a responsibility to the whole group. It's your responsibility as a group member to finish your project on time. You promised. And conventional messages often also contain conventional things like threats. So if you don't finish the project, then I will tell our boss. If you don't finish the project, you'll be kicked out, or there'll be bad consequences for your career, and so on. How do they manage threats to face? They manage threats to face with conventional politeness forms that I've talked about in my other videos. So indirectness, using the four conventional politeness strategies, redress, indirectness, not just please and thank you, but they'll use those things too. So that's the second level of development. Finally, the third level of development is what's called the rhetorical logic of message design, or the rhetorical message design logic. And just like the others, this way of thinking about language and communication has its own rules and dimensions for evaluation and orientation to time and coherence and so on. So I'll go over those things so we get an idea of what rhetorical is. So the rhetorical believes that language and communication is mostly about the creation and negotiation of social selves and situations, so that they believe that the social world is in flux, that roles and identities and meanings are created in interaction, and that we use language to create these meanings, and that's the primary purpose of language and communication is to negotiate the meaning, to negotiate the meaning of the situation and its goals and purposes and our identities and our roles, and all of that is actually in flux and subject to negotiation in this interaction, and that's what they think language is for. When a rhetorical thinks about what makes a message good or bad, they think a message is good to the extent it's flexible, it's symbolically sophisticated, so it uses a lot of sophisticated language, that it relies on deep interpretation of the elements of the message, and that it attempts to negotiate the meanings of the social situation, especially to negotiate consensus between the parties. They think the main goal of communication is negotiating consensus about what we're up to here, what our goals are, what our identities are, what our obligations are, rather than seeing those things as fixed in the and expressive ignores those things. The conventional thinks those things are fixed, and the rhetorical thinks that all those things are flexible and fluid, and that in fact language and communication and interaction creates all those things. So the point is to use language to create the meaning of the situation that will be most conducive to satisfying everyone's wants and needs and goals. So whereas the expressive ignores the context, the conventional feels bound by the context to be appropriate to it, the rhetorical thinks they can create the context on their own. What else? So we often think of politicians using rhetoric or mere rhetoric. We use the term rhetoric in a kind of pejorative way, thinking that it's bad, because it seems like politicians think if they say things frequently enough, then it makes it true. They believe that language creates reality. Well, that is sort of what the rhetorical design logic says too, that the social world is fluid and flexible. It's created and recreated in interaction, so we can use language to shape social reality itself. So rhetorical users of language will try to use explicit context-defining phrases to define what the situation is. So like rhetorical message producers in the Ron situation will say things like, Ron, I know you're a cooperative guy. Ron, I know what you're trying to do, Ron, is to figure out a way to get your part done in time. That might not be what Ron is trying to do at all, but the rhetorical message producer is trying to impose that meaning on the situation because they think language is capable of doing that. So there are fundamental differences in the way people think about what communication is good for, what its purposes are. These represent steps along the developmental continuum, where the expressive logic of message design is the earliest logic we all learn, where we think language is just for expressing our thoughts and emotions in an unedited way, which is often very ineffective. There's a lot of things that I'm thinking that are not appropriate to say. And if I do say them, they'll be very hurtful or inappropriate and so on. The conventional logic is when we learn, oh, there's a whole bunch of rules, social rules of appropriateness and politeness and so on that I have to learn and internalize and then act appropriately in social situations. And eventually we learn that these rules themselves are flexible. They can be negotiated in communication, and that the social world itself is not fixed, but is renegotiated and recreated in every interaction. And you can use language strategically to recreate the meaning of a situation and people's rights and responsibilities and roles and obligations and identities in ways that help satisfy people's goals. So that's the logic of message design. Next time somebody says something to you that seems incomprehensible, that seems totally inappropriate, maybe it's because they're generating their message out of a different logic of message design. In a subsequent video coming up soon, I'm going to show you some actual examples of people's responses to the Ron situation to illustrate these different logics of message design. So I hope you find that interesting and helpful and entertaining. And if you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Go on over to howcommunicationworks.com and sign up for our email list. Share this video with your friends. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.